welcome to the Round 14 review here on the channel. After the Blues beat the West Coast Eagles for the second time this season down at Optus Stadium on the graveyard shift Sunday night. It was 12 goals, 14, 86 to 7 goals, 10, 52. It was a win, which is the most important thing. Winning's not the only important thing, but it is absolutely the most important part of sport and any competition. It was a weird game in some parts. It was another example of, to be honest, it was the same story in the way in which games have played out for the most part of 2025. Strong starts against sides who we're favoured to beat, really strong starts, followed by, the rest of the game where it just doesn't have the same energy across the four quarters. And I find another layer of frustration appearing, but I guess it depends how you're looking at it. I went into the game getting a bit of the rhetoric throughout the week about what the expectations were from the fan base. And I mean, for me personally, I was really hoping that we would keep the Eagles to 50 or less, which kind of did, 52 points. Was hoping for a convincing performance and really just to continue on finding wins. We're in this patch of the season in this block of four where we've got opposition that we're going to be heavily favoured to beat. So at the end of the day, you've got to get your job done. And it was done. The game was a tale of similarity, as I said. Get to that first quarter. Wet weather from what the commentators were talking about and people who were at the game. It was wet and slippery, and it looked wet and slippery for the Eagles, and it did not look wet and slippery for Carlton. I mean, that first quarter was one of the better performing quarters that you'll see this group have. Straight out the gates, straight away we were seeing free-flowing ball movement, 50 handball receives in the first quarter, which is different. We have seen the Blues not take the game on as much this season as what we saw in that first quarter. Repeat inside 50s. I thought the first quarter is exactly the antidote to what I think a lot of us have been hoping for. There's a lot of talk around game style, modern game. A lot of that rhetoric around modern game is centered around free-flowing, instinctive football. And I think that is exactly what was showcased in the first quarter. And, from my lens, I thought the game was put to bed almost in a quarter of football. The tackle pressure was immense. Lockie Fogarty, who, has, had his moments where there's criticism and critique. He kicks 2-3 goals. We saw an uptick in impact from him, Chincotta, McGovern, second week in a row playing in this forward role. I think once Fogarty kicked his second goal, it just looked like a complete belting was on the cards. The ability for the Blues to move quickly when taking marks and utilize the runners and, create the overlap and the showcase of the handball chains, it was all positive. It was all exactly what I was hoping to see from the game. Everything that I want to see from improvement, goals from defensive half, goals from kick-ins, Carlton kicking goals from kick-ins, running the ball to the length of the ground, kicking the ball to the length of the ground. It was brilliant. We get to the end of the first quarter, and I thought it was borderline the perfect quarter. I think 7 goals, 4 in that first quarter. 46-7, up by 39 points. And I mean, I was watching from home, listening to the commentators. You could just sort of sense, what they were in for the day. It's like, okay, well, this is going to be a comprehensive Carlton win. Really interesting to hear Andrew McWalter at quarter time. He was seething at quarter time. We had completely broken the Eagles systematically. He was asked, what'd you make of the first quarter? And he just blatantly said, it was pathetic. We had dominated contested possession, dominated uncontested possession, and really had set the game up from there. The second quarter started okay, kicked a couple of goals, blew the margin out a little bit more. We did see the Eagles kick a couple in that second quarter, and get to halftime, we've increased the lead to 46 points, 68-22, and from there, that second half fade out narrative started to rear its head. There were some other factors about the game which I think came to play. Charlie Curnow didn't play in the second half. To be honest, I don't think he played much of the second quarter. He was getting looked at. Will Schofield was talking about how he was doing run-throughs and went back on the field, and he identified that it could have been a bit of a soft tissue issue. And then we had confirmation that Charlie Curnow was going to be subbed out of the game with calf tightness. Corey Durden inserted into the third quarter, and away we went from there. We then were further compounded by the backup ruck and that next forward target in Hudson O'Keefe going down with a hamstring. Started seeing that there's something about the third quarter at the moment where we just start seeing some wild errors. And I think one of the big contrasts that we're all seeing at the moment, none of this is hidden, is the energy that is created early in the game, the overlap running, the handball receives, real running power, running in waves, handball chains, and then that just stops. That doesn't have the same intensity moving forward. It then became a bit more of a management, relying on the kicking game. And I think, we're just not I think, I know, we're not that team that can just kick the ball, manage the game for too long. I mean, we've got to learn how to do it. The best teams in the competition have the balance between knowing when to go and when to slow. And I think for the most part, we saw the Blues just, slow the game down, take the pace off the game as much as possible, and almost go into a management mode after that first quarter, and particularly after that first half, compounded by all of a sudden looking so clean with the ball in what seemed to be wetter conditions, to then succumbing to the conditions and starting to get a little bit fumbly in that second half. A few errors start compounding the frustration, kicking errors, handball errors. Blake Acres takes the mark after running really hard to get that ball, plays on, hits the post, things like that. Get to the third quarter, up by 40, so obviously lose the third quarter, 77-37. And again, I at no point felt that the Eagles were putting the game in a position where the Blues were going to lose that game. I just thought it was all right, got the win, and, away we go, bank the 4 points. And, I think a lot of the frustration comes to how we win, margin. But at the same time, I don't think that is the total truth around the rhetoric that I'm seeing. And it also does depend who you're talking to. We end up winning the game by 34 points, which I think was disappointing to see the margin come back there. I would have liked to see the Blues kick on with it and completely dismantle the Eagles and, go on with it and, win by 10 plus goals. Now, winning by 10 plus goals, does that mean that things are fixed? No, it doesn't. And then there's also the mitigating factor and the reality that, forward structure broke down, particularly in that fourth quarter. But when you look at why, and you look at what the conditions of the game were, not the weather conditions, but the conditions of the team. So you've got Charlie and Hudson O'Keefe who start the game with McGovern in that forward line. You sort of play towards that. Charlie goes down, didn't play in the second half at all. Hudson goes down, didn't play in the fourth quarter at all. So one down on the bench, one tall in the forward line, no backup ruck out there. Cripps has to chop out as well while De Koning's getting his rest. And I think that is part of the reason. And also, game was won, I thought. we get on with it and we win the game. It was and it is a really interesting time watching the Blues, and I think a lot of it has to do with perception, and I think the frustration of the past and not being able to stay in the moment as supporters is sometimes taking effect. Got to the fan cams straight after the siren, and I could still feel that frustration from some, which I understand. The whole 30 years thing, and I think also the perception of this is where we're at. Comparing to where Geelong are, comparing to where Collingwood are, comparing to where the top teams are, and I don't know. From my point of view, I have seen enough this year to suggest that we're just not one of those top teams. And it's interesting because that's real. That's being a realist, understanding we're not in the top echelon of the competition. There are deficiencies to the game. But I also do think it is clouding what is going well. There are young individuals in this team that are showcasing their ability in the early stages of their career. I speak of guys like a Matt Carroll, speak of guys like Jackson Binns. I think Ollie Hollands continues to impress and continues to grow. I think on the other end, you've got senior guys like Fantasia, who has had a wretched run with injury this season, played his second game for the year. I thought he showed really positive signs, particularly in that first half when we were going and we were active. Alex Chincotta's come into the team now for his second game. He obviously played a role on Liam Baker, limited Liam Baker relatively, and also hit the scoreboard and also generated some offense as well. A bit of the talk around this week was, his job last week on Zach Merritt, and so he nullified his opponent, and the question was, can you impact on the other end? I thought we got that. Lockie Fogarty hits the scoreboard. 3 goals early. Didn't go on with it and kick 12 or kick 6. He kicked 3, had the 17 touches, was a link in the chain at times, played one of his best games of the season, if not his career. I think the defence held up. The back 6, back 7 held up. Nick Haynes, Jack Silvani didn't really need to do too much. They weren't bothered too much, let's be honest. Jacob Wiedering played a better game than what he had in the last few weeks. And I find myself just trying to find a way to enjoy it and repurpose, not my expectations. I expect to win. I expect to win these games. And we got there, and I almost find myself trying to just keep moving. And I think at the end of the day, the comparison to a couple of things is sometimes taking away the enjoyment from a lot of people. And that's just my perception. The comparison to other teams, as I mentioned, and where they're at and where we're at, which I think is fine because you look at the yardstick in the competition and where you want to get to. The comparison to where the perception is where Carlton should be, and they should be better. And for whatever reason, it's clouding the context. Harry, Charlie, Walsh out of this team is going to have an impact on the way it looks. When you take away individuals who can do great things and make things look easier, it's going to take effect. For all the talk around Charlie and he's not performing to the level that he can, well, the reality is when Charlie is on the field, it does give a better structure ahead of the ball. Opposition have to put their best defender on him, and opposition have to have a second defender nearby at all times, because I think Charlie Curnow one-on-one is a nightmare matchup. And, from the Carlton point of view, for some supporters, like, oh, well, he's out of form. Well, you don't see opposition supporters and opposition coaches not planning for Charlie because they'll say, oh, well, he's not playing as well as he can, so we'll just play one-on-one and leave him there. So, it's not rocket science. The inconsistency in dominance is there. And maybe that's part of the frustration as well. When you see the team run and carry and overlap and handball chain and look as clean as they do in the first quarter, I too see that, and I think, wow, something's changing here. Like, oh wow, like this is it. This is the turning point, and it's extreme. But then there's a reality of football, and it's very rare that you're going to get that first quarter for 4 quarters. Any team, it's very rare that you're going to go on and kick 160 points in a game of football and win by 95. It doesn't happen often. Pre-game, the talk was maybe it's a banana peel game. The Eagles, they showed a bit against Geelong. They showed a bit. They got heart and spirit. They're back at home. So, yeah, I do definitely have questions around like why it looks the way it does from a mental aspect of wanting to take the game on and then wanting to manage the game for so long. Like I can really understand wanting to manage the game and learn how to manage the game and learn how to play within the 2 gears or 3 gears, because that's something this group have not done consistently enough. Even if you look back at the big scarring game in round 1, it was a very similar story. It was dominant early, seemingly put the game to bed, and then managed. Now, the issue then was that it wasn't managed because they end up losing the game. And the hallmarks of that performance were not dissimilar to what we saw in round 14 and a little bit of round 13 as well. Gain the ascendancy and then, pull back a bit. And so that is the next layer. Where I'm at right now overall is just understanding, rather than this team being the premiership threat of 2025, I can clearly see from 14 rounds that they're not that. So it's more so building towards being that, and whether you want to hear that or you don't want to hear that, that's on you. You'll see what you want to see and you won't see what you don't want to see. It's not accepting mediocrity. It's being, if anything, it's being a realist. We can live in the hypotheticals all we want. The other reality is, we did sort of lose that second half against the Eagles. And there was rhetoric around, we played 1 quarter and then sort of lost the 3. Well, we played so well in that first quarter that the game was put to bed. The Eagles won a couple of quarters, not by much. The game I thought was well and truly sewn up early and put to bed. And yeah, obviously we want to be entertained. People want to be entertained. We want to see dominance. There's a dominant performance yesterday and going on and winning that game by, 70 plus. Does that mean we're back? Well, no, it doesn't. We saw early in the season, won by 71, generated a lot of scoring opportunities. But the rhetoric then was, why is everyone celebrating like we won the flag? Just calm down. Take your rose-colored glasses off and stop drinking the Kool-Aid. Well, okay. Well, yeah. So I just see a bit more to move forward with than what meets the eye. And that's where I'm at. I can somewhat understand disappointment and frustration, and we want to be there. And the reality is this: we are 6-7. That is reality, and that is a fact. With games that we won that we should have won, given we're favoured, there are games that we've let slip that we also maybe should have won. Therefore frustration is there. But season is alive. 6-7. Moving on to round 15, we'll get back to the MCG on Saturday afternoon against North Melbourne, and we kind of go from there. So that's kind of the summary for round 14. I'm just honestly at this point, like I said last week, just literally looking at it moment by moment. Anytime I venture into the future, and like I know we talk about ladder predictors and things like that. You got to have fun with it at some point. I just refuse to sit in the miserable. I'm not someone that wants to sit there and mope about it. Does that mean I'm accepting mediocrity? We have different versions of mediocrity. What I accept is that we are in the process of trying to build something to hopefully win a flag one day. And that part is an unknown. It's not convincing at the moment. It's not, but that makes sense because the team is not ready to win a flag in round 14 2025. It's just not. So, yeah. What about you? How did you absorb that game? Maybe after a sleep, you've seen it a little bit differently. Maybe after you've watched the replay, you've seen it a little bit differently. Were there any signs in that game that you saw that, you think we can take away and move forward with? Whether it was individuals, whether it was parts of the game style that you think, okay, we can move forward with that. Document your sentiment below, and we'll chat about it and we'll go from there. Go Blues.